Thanks, Broadcasting Hansard. Thank you. I now call officers from NBN Co. Mr. Quigley, just before I come to you, there's been a threshold issue raised by the opposition, and that is whether your opening statement is in a form that could be tabled prior to your opening statement being made, or at the same time while you're doing it. Is that possible?
Well, we don't have hard copies, but I understand we're trying to get it emailed. So it's attempting to be emailed now, I think, to the...
So you're good. So you're doing your best to get that to
yes.
That's good. Now, just before I ask you whether you have an opening statement, which you obviously have, are you aware of correspondence correspondence to you and to myself and various other ministers and the department dated the 14th of May 2012 from Senators Birmingham and Fisher?
I am. I received that letter. It was a letter, came through the post. I received it on Monday afternoon.
Monday afternoon,
yes.
Yeah. Now, there's quite an extensive range of issues in it. There's issues being raised about you appearing alone at the estimates hearings. Obviously, that's changed.
Yep.
Your use of substantial time for an opening statement. There was an issue I've already raised with the department, critical of the department. And then there was 3 requests being made. First, that the NBN represents itself in a fashion that allows at least 50% of questions from non-government senators about its operations to be answered immediately rather than taken on notice. Secondly, that a request that as far as practicable you limit your opening statement to financial or operational developments. That's not something that's been asked of any other department or government business entity that appears here, so that's something different in my experience. And third, in order to avert situations where apparently straightforward inquiries inexplicably can't be answered, either NBN Co or the department, the principal lines of questioning about the NBN that the coalition intends to pursue at these estimates hearings are described in Appendix A. Now, again, that's something I've never experienced before. I'm not saying it hasn't happened before. There's 2 appendices to the letter. Appendix A, which goes to a whole range of questions. The first area, metrics and rollout. The second area, risk management. The third area, liabilities and prospective outlays in 2013. And the fourth area, questions about special access undertakings. And appended to that as Appendix B is Senator Conroy's the 3rd of May press release. And basically the opposition are indicating that they need answers to these questions so they can develop their policy. Now, with that, I'd be asking you, are you in a position to answer these questions? Firstly, do you want to make an opening statement?
Yes, I would like to make an
So if you're going to make an opening statement, I think that's fine. It's what other departments and business entities do. And could you then turn your mind to these questions, the specific questions that have been raised by Senator Birmingham and Senator Fisher? It's unusual to have the questions beforehand, so you've got them, and are you in a position to deal with them?
Yes, as I said, Chair, I did receive the questions on Monday afternoon, but I have done my best to try and answer each and every one of the questions, and I will do that after the opening statement, if you think that's best.
Yeah, I think that's appropriate. You've had these questions for a short period of time, and it's appropriate, I think, that you deal with them as the threshold issue. So your opening statement then to the correspondence, basically.
Yep, exactly.
Thanks, Mr. Quigley.
Okay, so if I start with the opening statement, we are now daily gaining momentum. I occasionally see commentary in the press that says we face setbacks and delays. Most of this commentary is based on the metrics we set out in our inaugural corporate plan, which was released some 17 months ago, and which was prepared barely 1 year after the company came into existence. So it's not surprising that the assumptions that we made in that first corporate plan have changed. For example, the assumptions about when the Telstra deal would be completed, how we would implement the ACCC's POI decision, that's Point of Interconnect decision, how we would execute the government's greenfield policy, which, by the way, was not finalised at the time of that corporate plan, and a number of other fundamental policy matters. A lot of work has been done by the company between December 2010 and today, so we are now in a position to finalise an updated corporate plan and submit it to the government following the board approval by the end of May. This new corporate plan will incorporate all of the policy decisions and learnings over the last 18 months. It will also obviously be consistent with our 12-month and 3-year rollout schedules that we made public in February and March of this year. If I can now turn to our progress, you may recall that when we last met here in February, we had around 5,500 premises connected to the NBN. 3 months later, we now have approximately 11,000 active connections across all 3 technologies. Also in that time, the total premises in area where work has commenced has risen to 318,000. At this stage, the work is predominantly design work being carried out in each FSAM, or fibre serving area module. We're doing this rollout by modules. There is understandably a lot of focus on construction of the access network, which is where connections to end users take place, but we are also seeing progress right across other parts of the network also. In particular, we're making very good progress on the deployment of our transit network. We've recently completed the first of the transit rings in Berkeley Vale in New South Wales on time and on budget. The transit rings connect fibre access node sites back to points of interconnect, and they are a vital part of the NBN. The Berkeley Vale ring runs through towns around the shores of Budgewoi Lake, including Wyong, Budgewoi, Noraville, the entrance Killarney Vale and Tumby Umby. This is the first of 178 rings that are scheduled to be built over the life of the project. A second Berkeley Vale ring is scheduled for completion by mid-June this year, and there are also another 19 transit rings currently under construction around Australia. For areas outside the fibre footprint, the interim satellite service continues to be a success, both on customer uptake and on satisfaction. We now have over 7,300 active services on the interim satellite. The long-term satellite project is also progressing well, and NBN Co has announced ground stations to be constructed near Merimbula and Burke. These are 2 of 10 satellite ground stations around the country. We expect in the very near future to be making an announcement on the tender outcome for the ground segment. I'm also pleased to report that our fixed wireless services is now up and running. We recently completed testing and now have 52 active connections as part of a trial in Armidale. This is a significant milestone for us because it means that for the first time, all 3 delivery technologies, fibre, satellite and fixed wireless, are now in operation. We continue to engage local communities by informing them in advance of us lodging applications for tower locations as part of the wireless rollout. So I've outlined some of the areas where we are building momentum, but as we all know, this is a large and complex project, and as I've committed to you, I will keep you updated not only of progress, but also of where we face challenges. One of the difficulties we are dealing with now is the accuracy of existing address files. When you consider we are tasked with building a broadband network to serve all premises, it is understandable that we need highly accurate data on where every premise is across the nation. This impacts almost every aspect of what we do, from planning and designing the network to building it and ultimately operating it. NBN Co receives this data from an external source, PSMA, who have a big task in pulling together information from a number of separately managed sources such as lands departments, local government and the Electoral Commission. When we try to use the data, there are a number of inconsistencies in it for our use. It's obviously a very useful data set, but it isn't quite what we need to do this job. We're finding that many addresses have been duplicated, are incorrect or missing, and we have cases where many addresses are assigned to a single point, often in the centre of a street. This is particularly an issue in the case of multi-dwelling units, such as blocks of files and office blocks. Could be that anything up to about 30% of the details we get in those files are inaccurate. This level of data inaccuracy means we have to take more time in the design stage to clean up this data, and we have also been directing our contractors to walk down every street in every FSAM in order to verify addresses. This is time-consuming, costly, and itself prone to error. Now, I should say that we're not in any way criticising the PSMA data. It's a very good data set, but that's just the reality of the complexity of dealing with a database that's trying to capture every address in the country. These were issues, by the way, that are not easily foreseen, and we are working on more efficient methods to speed up the process, but this does, of course, all take time. A second area of difficulty for us is greenfields, which I did flag at the last estimates and at the last joint committee on the NBN, and we've also raised it in response to media questions recently. So while this is not news to you, I'll just take a moment, if I can, to explain it clearly. I think it's fair to say that executing on the greenfields component of the project is the most difficult aspect of the project at this point in time. One of the major challenges is to construct high-speed backhaul links to all of these locations, all of these new greenfield locations. On average, we have to provide about 6 kilometres of new fibre backhaul, often involving new ducts and trenches from a new development site to where we can interconnect with the existing network. That's so from every site, on average, 6 kilometres to pick up the existing network. And obviously in remote sites, the extreme of which is a place like Mount Newman, these distances are obviously much longer. Because of this new duct civil works, we have to go through associated approvals process. The good news is that we are overcoming the problems of doing this for the first time, and as we continue to build out our transit network, which I mentioned earlier, the distances we need to span reduce. And we are working closely with the developers, who clearly see the appeal of having NBN rolled out to their new estates, and a number are using the availability of the NBN rollout to differentiate their offerings from existing homes in the suburbs. So you can be assured we are working hard to meet the requirements of our greenfields customers. But in an effort to increase our rollout capacity, we are increasingly involving our brownfields construction contractors in the greenfield build. So we're bringing more capacity online for greenfields. Turning now to our product offerings, we are on course to release the first of our products for Australian businesses later this year. The first release will allow retail service providers, our customers, to supply business users with high-speed broadband and multiple line telephony capability. The product design recognises that businesses operate around the clock, and so we are providing increased service levels for this market segment. Potential applications of this set of business products includes e-learning and health applications, small business broadband and telephony bundles, video conferencing, video collaboration services, and multi-line telephony. There will be more information about this and future business product releases as we get closer to the release dates. If I can, I'd like to now turn to the report of the Regional Telecommunications Independent Review Committee, which I understand was released yesterday. The report contained a number of recommendations relating to NBN Co. I'm told one of these recommendations relates to extending the eligibility of the interim satellite service to include schools, health clinics and local government facilities. I also understand that the Minister has confirmed today that that will be the case. Yes. So, if I can conclude, we're dealing with challenges methodically as they arise, and the rollout really is now gaining momentum. I want to mention, in fact, if I can, just here an important data point from what we're seeing on the ground. Overall, 38% of active services on our fibre network have been on the fastest speed tier, which is 100 megabits per second down and 40 megabits per second up. That was 38%. Only 16% of the active services on our fibre network are for entry-level speed tier of 12 meg down and 1 meg up. The data for April, this trend's even stronger, with almost 50% of new active services being on the highest speed tier of 100 megs. This trend is also seen in Canada, where Bell Alliance has been rolling out fibre to the home for a number of years. They recently added a new 250 megabits per second down and 30 megabits per second up speed tier to their available plans. And that's because they said that 40% of their users access a number of services simultaneously, creating demand for higher bandwidth. I just want to end with what I think is a clear indication that support by the Australian public for the NBN continues to grow. A recent Essential survey suggested support for the NBN is at record levels. This survey confirms what we also see in local councils and communities, that there is widespread support for the project independent of voting preferences. So, Chair, if I now could turn to the letter I received from Senators Fisher and Birmingham. Before I begin to answer the 30 questions which were in the letter, there was one particular passage which I must admit surprised me. It asked that NBN Co represent itself at this hearing, and I quote, in such a fashion that allows at least 50% of questions from non-government senators about its operations to be answered immediately rather than taken on notice. This didn't gel with my recollection, so I asked someone to go back and check the numbers from the last committee hearing on February 14th. Our count showed that around 92 questions were asked by non-government senators, and of these, 74 were answered at the hearing. That's around 80%. So I'm puzzled as to why Senators Birmingham and Fisher are asking me to answer at least 50% of questions at the hearing. When I read in the letter that scrutiny of the NBN at these hearings is frequently constrained by the large number of questions taken on notice, I have to tell you that I don't think that represents reality. We do not shy away from scrutiny at all, but I need to make sure as the CEO of NBN Co that we keep focus on the main task at hand, which is to build a network that will serve the needs of all Australians for the coming decades. Now moving to the specifics of the letter. The first point I would like to address is my decision to appear alone. As you can see, I now have three of my direct reports here. Notwithstanding that even if I had brought the entire senior management team, there will always be matters, usually very detailed factual questions that require checking before a definitive answer can be provided. So if I can introduce my colleagues, we have Jim Hassel, who looks after all of our regulatory product sales, account management, and probably a few other things, Jim. We have our Chief Technology Officer, Mr. Gary McLaren, next to him. Gary looks after all of our network architecture and all of the design, all of the technical stuff. And I'd have to say it's the first time I think I've seen Gary in a tie for 3 years. And to my immediate right is Mr. Kieran Cooney, who looks after all of our government relations and media and communications and general marketing. So these gentlemen are with me today. You also expressed concerns in the letter regarding the time taken for an opening statement. Firstly, I view my opening statements as an opportunity to provide what I believe is a useful update for the committee as a whole, although I recognise this is not always seen as the best use of time by opposition senators. But the statement is for all members of the committee, and I believe, as part of the operations of these committees, it is an important means of placing on the Hansard record the facts about progress with the project since the previous estimates hearings, so the Australian public have the opportunity to be briefed also, so that we can get facts onto the public record. It also a proper means to correct the record or dispel myths, and we do have some of those. So I'd hope that these hearings provide a useful avenue for getting facts onto the table. Secondly, I do not agree that it duplicates information already provided to Parliament. Let me give you some examples. The rollout statistics I provided in my opening statements are the latest available, and they're often at the day of the hearing, and so they certainly do not repeat information provided twice a year to the Joint Committee on the NBN, the JCNBN. I've also used these statements to flag emerging issues that have the potential to impact on the project's schedule and cost. For example, at the February estimates, I raised for the first time the challenges we're experiencing in greenfields. At that estimates, I also announced the release of our 12-month rollout schedule and provided an update on such things as a 3-year rollout announcement, the number of RSPs that had signed on to the WBA, and the latest pricing data. This is information that is not available publicly. I would have thought it to be of interest to the committee, the media that monitors these hearings, and the Australian public. I strongly believe this is part of the proper accountability that is required of us as a government business enterprise. You then requested that as far as practicable, I limit the detail of my opening statement to financial or operational developments, subsequent or additional information to the most recent report from the shareholder ministers to the Joint Committee on the National Broadband Network. That's what the letter said. My understanding was that my opening statement was not constrained by any particular guidelines from the committee, but was an opportunity for me to update senators on progress, both operational and financial progress, including matters that are not in the public domain but are of particular relevance in my accounting to the members of this committee. In the 3 or more hours that I normally appear before this committee, I believe that the 15 to 20 minutes to provide this statement is time well spent. Of course, I'm more than happy to be guided by the Chair and members of the committee on what they would prefer going forward. You raised the issue of information critical for the coalition broadband policy development in your letter. Our job as a GBE is to execute on the policies and directives set by the government of the day and articulated by the statement of expectations we've received from the government. We, of course, will do our best to answer any questions you have, but I'm sure you understand that when it comes to forward forecasts that are contained in our corporate plan, which is a GBE we submit to the government, it is their decision as to when and how they make that information publicly available. If I now could turn to the letter itself. The first 3 dot points relate to forecasts in the corporate plan that we're about to submit, which will be going to the government shortly. So they will be in the corporate plan. It's up to the government to release that information as it sees fit. On the next 2 dot points...
Mr Quigley, is this on Appendix A?
This is Appendix A I'm addressing now. So I'm addressing dot point by dot point.
Okay.
So the first 3, as I said, will be in the corporate plan. The next 2 points, as far as I'm aware, there are good estimates on households, but there are no estimates from the ABS of business premises in Australia. We certainly, and those data points on the number of households across Australia, I don't expect to be different in our next corporate plan than they were in the 210 corporate plan. On point 6, on activated services, I think I addressed that in my opening statement. Point 7 on NBN's revenue for the past 12 months, that was provided in the government's report to the JCBN provided on the 9th of April on page 22, which I assume the senators have access to. Points 8 and 9 were also in the JCBN report, I think on the same page. Point 10, you asked about cumulative equity and cash burn. This is contained also in the report to the JCBN on page 24. Point 11 on cumulative capex by technology. This is also available in the report to the JCBN on page 20. In point 12, we do not provide costs per premises because, frankly, it will prejudice ongoing negotiations with contractors, which are still ongoing. Points 13 and 14 relate to the average revenue per user split between households and commercial premises. We don't split this out, but I can tell you that as at the end of March, the average revenue per user was $29.55. If I can now address the next one, which was what proportion of Australia premises currently have various access speeds. On take-up of services by speed of service, obviously for satellite, the service is 6.1, as you know, on the interim satellite. For fibre, the take-up is of 12 megabits per second download speeds is 18%. For 25 megabits per second, it's 35%. For 50 megabits per second, it's 10%. And for 100 megabits per second, it's 37%. That's the averages. As I mentioned also in April, those numbers at the high speeds are climbing up. On the next 6 questions...
Just Mr Quigley, can you just take the take-up service by speed? Can you just run through them a bit more slowly, thanks?
Yep. They were the 12 megabits, which is the lowest rate, 12 megabits down, 1 megabit up, is 18%. The 25 megabits per second service is 35%. The 50 megabits per second service is 10%. And the 100 megabits per second is 37%.
Thank you.
So the next 6 questions, next 6 dot points, relate to the request for NBN estimates related to characteristics of the general Australian broadband market. So before I answer the question, I need to clarify, were you talking about the total overall market, including mobile, including satellite? Does it include HFC? I presume you're not including dial-up. So I wonder if I could get a clarification from the 2 senators. What?
Senator Birmingham.
Sorry, Mr. Quigley, I have been attempting to take notes of Mr. Quigley's comments, which, seeing as Mr. Quigley's reading of something, probably could have been tabled, but could Mr. Quigley ask the question again?
Yes, the 6 points under the question, Senator, that said what proportion of Australian premises does NBN estimate currently have, and you gave a range of different questions there, different characteristics. It's quite difficult to answer that without knowing whether you're talking about the entire Australian broadband market, including wireless, satellite or fixed line, including HFC. Do you exclude dial-up? Which perimeter would you like me to address the question to?
Well, if you have all of the data there for all of the different perimeters, let's just go with fixed line, please.
With fixed line,
including
okay.
HFC.
So, sorry, just before you go further, if I could just indicate, Senator Birmingham, you made a little bit of a sarcastic comment about Mr. Quigley reading out his response. There are more than just senators watching this hearing at the moment. So I think it's actually valuable for all the people who are watching online at the moment to be able to hear this read out, not just see a piece of paper table, because they won't have access to it at all. So I think it's actually important for a broader range of dissemination than just the 6 or 7 people in the room.
Thanks, Chair. Sarcastic comments have already flowed both ways, but
no, I'm actually making a legitimate point.
Mr. Quigley could have at least provided copies to the committee so that Senator Cameron didn't have to slow Mr. Quigley down while we take notes. That's all.
Well, look, can I just indicate that I have a clear view that we don't run estimates by the papers. It's not going to be exchanges of paper. Estimates are not like that, and it shouldn't be like that.
We could have done what we did with the opening statement, that's all.
And that won't be happening as long as I'm the chair of the committee. Thanks, Mr. Quigley.
So if I can also say, Senator, there's obviously this, I got these questions on Monday afternoon. To be frank, I've been spending a lot of time trying to get the answers, including right up until basically I turned up in this building. So if I can also, just to be clear, the speeds that you asked quite a number of questions about speed tiers. Is it the advertised peak rate or the delivered rate?
The delivered rate.
Okay. Okay, so if we narrow that down, as you say, I think probably the best, what I should quote is the data available from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, which is the 210 ABS report. That was, in fact, report number 8153 from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. They estimated that the percentage of broadband lines in the 256 kilobits per second to less than 512 kilobits per second is 2.9%. 512 kilobits per second to less than 1.5 megabits per second is at 9.9%. 1.5 megabits per second to less than 8 megabits per second is 41.8%. 8 megabits per second to less than 24 megabits per second is 36.2%, and 24 megabits per second or greater is at 9.3%. So the next question, if I can, just under those dot point, relates to what proportion of each of these categories of Australian premises NBN Co estimate. I'll read the question. What proportion of each of these categories of Australian premises does NBN Co estimates its network, broken down by satellite, fixed, wireless and fibre, will have covered or passed at each of the above dates? I'm not sure I understand that question completely.
I'll apologise for the fact that there's a typo, Mr. Quigley, and assuming given the lack of understanding, you can move on to the next one.
No, it's not so much a typo. I just don't understand the question.
Well,
Senator.
yes. Well, there are no above dates, are there? So clearly that is a typo.
Sorry?
There are no above dates.
No, I presume the above dates are the 4 categories right at the top of the letter.
Oh, sorry, right at the top.
But Senator Birmingham, Senator Fisher, you drafted the letter. I'm sure you can clarify the situation. Thanks.
We just have.
The question
Well, but you just said move on.
Yes, I have said Mr Quigley can move on.
Well, I'm not interested in Mr Quigley moving on right at this stage.
Well, then you ask him the question you want him to answer.
I'd be interested in hearing the answer to this question and how it's supposed to be.
Then we'd invite him to answer them with,
But,
with
you know,
reference to the financial years at the top of the question, which I think are reasonably obvious.
The dates are obvious, Senator. I don't understand what the question means, though. I'm not sure what the question is asking.
Clarify it.
I'd like to answer it, I just don't know what it's saying.
Well, Mr Quigley, you can move on. I'll reread in the context of the top of that page and the question, and if we want to come back to it, we can come back to it.
Okay, I'll move on to risk management.
I just want to indicate that, you know, the reason this was done, as I understand it, was to get answers to these questions. And hopefully you'll be in a position to advise Mr Quigley of the intent of this question before we move on to further areas of the hearing tonight.
So-
Birmingham said that he'll come back to it later in the course of the night.
I'm just surprised that the two authors of the letter are here and we can't get clarity, that's all. So, Mr Quigley.
Would you like to take it on notice?
I think the Chair's given Mr Quigley the call. Let's move on.
If I move on to risk management, so the next section is on risk management, and obviously I can't answer for DBCDE. You did ask a question about DBCDE and NBN Co, so obviously I can answer for NBN Co. The first area was in risks on the satellite deal with L'Oreal. So as you know, we take risk management very seriously in the company, so I'd like to give you a complete answer since it is an important topic. First of all, I'd say that we've established a risk management framework compliant with Australian and New Zealand standards, which is also compliant with ISO 31000. We do detailed risk assessments. They're an ongoing activity across the satellite program at the supplier working levels, at the project levels and at the program levels. The identification and mitigation management of major risk forms part of the regular reporting regime to senior executive management and to the board of the company. The assessment of risk, both commercial and technological, along with other key criteria, have been key elements in the selection of solutions, suppliers and other key decisions made across the program. Some examples of that, the selection of Space Systems L'Oreal was seen as a low-risk selection given their heritage in the construction of very large, and by very large I mean greater than 6,000 kilogram or 6 tonnes, Ka-band satellites, including most recently the Viasat-1 satellite and the Hughes Jupiter satellite. We do financial risk assessments. They're conducted on supplier organisations as part of the procurement due diligence process. We engaged Optus as a managed service provider for the interim satellite solution because they were considered a low-risk option compared with NBN Co attempting to quickly establish an in-house satellite operational capability with a target commercial product to market by July 2011.
Mr Quigley, I'm sorry to do this to you, but I mean, we are putting all this on Hansard. Could I ask you just to maybe
slow down a bit? Just
a little bit, because
sure.
some of the some of the information is coming out at a very rapid rate.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks.
Was that a request from Hansard?
It's a request from me to help Hansard.
I've never heard Hansard request anybody to slow down before
Well, I'm asking,
in my 5 years in the Parliament.
Well, that's okay. I'm asking a slow down.
It's quite fine.
So, thanks.
So, at a more detailed level, NBN Co staff participate in subsystem
Insult to
risk and
Hansard.
qualification reviews with Space System L'Oreal.
It is.
Recent examples include joint assessments on the satellite's battery and solar panel subsystems. Key risks that we continue, our management team continue to track across the satellite program include the coordination of frequency use from NBN's CO's preferred and ITU filed orbital locations. And if you recall, there was, for those of you present, an interesting debate at the JCBN on orbital slots.
You're not allowed to talk about that because people watching just won't know what you're talking about, according to the Minister. So,
thank you, Senator. So we are, in fact, successfully progressing further through the coordination process with other operators using similar frequencies from neighbouring orbital locations. This risk is trending low, and we rate risks in the company. So NBN Co is on track to concluding the necessary coordination exercise well before the launch. The ability to use uplink spectrum required for satellite operations from required ground station regions. This was originally a high risk, now considered low, as we've entered into commercial agreements with other satellite operators who currently utilise the required spectrum in the regions required. The ability to procure or lease sites for the ground stations within the preferred regions, as determined by the satellite spot beam design and frequency plan. That was a higher risk at the beginning. That's now trending down to low, as we've announced agreements with regional councils, two of which I mentioned in my opening statement. There is, of course, the failure at launch risk, and NBN Co is currently analysing launch service proposals from suppliers. And we look obviously at the heritage they have for heavy launch capability, with satellites of similar masses to that that we expect to launch. To assist NBN Co in the assessment of risks in the satellite area, the companies I'm about to mention and individuals have been engaged. Each are considered experts in their respective fields. That is Telesat, a Canadian-based leading global fixed satellite service operator, the Fraunhofer Institute, which is Europe's largest applied research organisation, Dr. Gordon Pike, who's an ex-Optus satellite program manager, and he's overseen several Optus satellite missions, and Bill Hope, who's an ex-Optus satellite executive. I would also like to mention, though, which I think is very important, is the team that NBN Co has assembled itself. The people that we have in NBN Co who are running the satellite project under the direction of Gary McLaren, sitting to my right. The team itself is comprised of members from the local and global space markets with over 250 years' experience across commercial broadband, television, digital radio, satellite and scientific and technology development satellite programs. We have people who have experience in Optus, the Australian Defence Force, AUSSAT, Telstra, OTC, Intelsat, Inmarsat, the European Space Agency, NASA, the United States Department of Defence, the United States National Science Foundation, the United States National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, Raytheon, World Space, British Aerospace, which is now EADS Astrium, Meosat, Telespazio, Asia Broadcast Satellite, MyTech, which is now part of Codan, Aerospace Technologies of Australia, the Aeronautical Research Laboratories, and also someone from the Cassini-Huygens scientific mission to Saturn. So that completes the NBN co-answer on the risk assessment for the satellite program from our view. I'm not sure if DE would like to add anything to that.
Well, I'm happy to say that we reviewed the risk assessment that was provided by NBN Co. Our officers particularly met on the likelihood of the allocation of slots. We were recorded in the NBN Co analysis as supporting the concept that it was low risk to allocate slots, which was the primary issue that instituted all this argument at the Joint Committee, and we provided appropriate advice to government on the satellite acquisition plan.
So if I can now move to the next question, which was what work has NBN Co board commissioned or sought on change of government risks? We look to the government of the day to provide directions, so I believe this is probably best answered by the Secretary of DBCDE, which I believe gave an answer to a similar question to the last previous hearing.
Well, I asked for guidance from Senator Birmingham. We did actually discuss the SAU in some detail earlier. I'm happy to discuss the SAU further or defer it for subsequent questioning. Its topic, as I identified at the time, particularly close to my heart. It's one of the things I think that will be tremendously important to reinforce the public policy aspects of this project. But in terms of an assessment of risks, we have not done an assessment of risks. It's not a risk matrix issue in my view. What we have done is, as I described earlier, we have spoken to all the relevant parties and provided advice about what we believe the Parliament intended with this legislation. That includes the ACCC, those representatives of industry who have cared to speak to us or who we've approached on the individual issues, and NBN Co on multiple occasions. And as a result of those interventions, some things have changed. I won't say everything has changed according to our prescriptions, but some things have changed, and we remain engaged in the process for the finalisation of the SAU, and will continue until it's completed.
Has Mr Harris departed from choreography, Minister?
Gary?
I'm answering your question about here. What assessment of risk has been undertaken on the SAU by DBCDE?
So, look, Senator Fisher, these are serious questions that you've put both to the Department and to NBN Co. I think they are doing a fantastic job in dealing with them in a systematic way. I don't think it does you or does this committee any good for any facetious positions or anything to be put to Mr Harris that goes to his credibility. It's just unfair and unacceptable.
If I answered the wrong...
No, you answered the question directly and succinctly, Mr Harris, so thank you.
And
I think that's the point that Senator Fisher was making.
Exactly.
I think Mr Quigley has also suggested that I might answer this question about NBN Co board commissioning or seeking advice on change of government risks. I've previously advised the Joint Committee on the NBN, where this issue again arose, that in my strong judgment, it is not the role of public servants to design public policy for the alternative government. All that can happen from a public servant, and this, Mr Quigley and I have had discussions from time to time about whether in fact he is a public servant. For this purpose, given that he runs a government business enterprise and follows the instructions of government under a statement of expectations, we expect that he will follow the requirements of public servants. We cannot design policy for the alternative government. If we were to design policy for the alternative government, it would effectively be the bureaucracy choosing to determine at what point an alternative government is likely. And that is an anti-democratic outcome. We cannot have a template for the public sector that says you can make a judgment that a government is about to change and design policy for that purpose.
Very simple. At the next election, that's going to happen.
Well, Mr Harris, have you anything further?
I didn't want to extend it. I'm happy to leave it at that. Yes, thank you.
Mr Quigley?
If I now move on, I can, Chair, to the liabilities and prospective outlays in 2013. The question was our best estimate of the aggregate value of NBA contractual liabilities and obligations. I would refer the senators to page 25 of the second government's report to the JC NBN of 9th of April, the one I referred to before, where there is a table of unaudited schedule of commitments. When it comes to forecasts into the future, that of course is the subject of the corporate plan, as I mentioned before. The next question is, what are the 5 largest outstanding contracts projected to be? If I could ask for some clarification of just exactly what's meant by that. It wasn't clear to me what was being asked.
Total value of the contract.
Of the contracts, what do you mean, Senator, if I can ask, by outstanding contracts?
Yet to be completed.
At the time of 2013.
Just to be, if I'm clear, you're asking me what's the value of contracts we haven't negotiated yet or finished negotiating yet?
No, contracts that will still be live contracts, as in not completed, at 2013.
So what's...
Negotiated yet not completed.
You'll
Still
have to
with
use your
something to
imagination.
go.
No, there's not a lot of imagination
No.
to that, I would have thought.
A year and a half away.
Well, you have contracts that go beyond 2013, Mr Quigley?
There are contracts... Yes, they're signed, but that's not a... Yes, for example, a satellite
There are
contract.
binding contracts between NBN Co and your suppliers that stretch beyond 2013.
Yes, but some of those are frame contracts. So we give, I think, and the government has provided, I think, in the budget papers, estimates of commitments. This is quite a complex issue to do, and by the way, we've got to be very careful, Senators, if I can beg your indulgence, that we have to be very careful about what information we make available on these types of things if we're still under negotiations. And construction contracts, which would be amongst some of our largest, are ones that are subject to ongoing negotiations.
And I imagine in that sense, You, of course, are always at liberty, Mr Quigley, in these processes to reveal the information that is not commercially sensitive, to frame your answers in a manner that you believe does not reveal commercially sensitive material, and to do your best endeavours, as I'm sure you will, to provide as much information as you reasonably can to the committee without jeopardising NBN Co's commercial position.
So, just to be clear then, so that is as of 2013, the value, the 5 largest from that date forward that is the company's committed to.
Mr Quigley, I don't expect you to have a crystal ball. As of today, contracts that you are entered into that stretch beyond 2013 in terms of their delivery.
As of today. Okay, we'll attempt to answer that one, Senator.
Thank you.
The next 3 questions about estimates of fibre premises connections into the future for fibre, for satellite and for fixed wireless, they will all be included as their forward forecasts in our next corporate plan, which we'll be submitting to the government by the end of May. If I can move to section 4, in what circumstances can the price control on the entry-level product be waived? The initial pricing on the set of basic, that is entry-level products, is fixed from the SAU commencement until the 30th of June 2017. It could only be changed by variation of the SAU, assessed by the ACCC in accordance with the legislative framework in respect of SAU variations. In any event, NBN Co has already made contractual commitments to its customers in relation to this pricing, which would hold prices constant until mid-2017, even in the absence of an accepted SAU. After the 30th of June 2017, these products are subject to a maximum price increase of half of CPI. That applies on an annual basis with no carry forward to subsequent years. This is not an automatic price increase, and I want to stress that it's not an automatic price increase. Rather, should NBN Co decide to increase any of its prices, it would need to formally notify its customers under the terms of its contract with them, subject to providing appropriate notice to them. This price increase limit applies to all products offered by NBN Co, including the entry-level products. NBN Co already has made contractual commitments to hold the price of many of these products constant for up to 3 years, which override the commitments in the SAU and provide additional certainty to NBN Co's customers. NBN Co can request ACCC approval for an exception to the CPI divided by 2 or half CPI annual increase on a case-by-case basis, subject to satisfying criteria which require consistency with the long-term interests of end users, which is a legislative criteria, and the applicable law, regulation and ministerial determinants of government policy. The SAU as lodged also contains an anti-avoidance provision to preclude NBN Co circumventing the individual price increase limits. The next question, what is NBN Co's forecast of movements in ARPU for the broadband and voice over FTTP and FTTN networks in the US market over the next 10 years? What is the basis of that forecast? And you had a follow-on question which...
Mr Quigley, I think you said the US, it says the UK here.
Yeah, the first question I think was the US market, and the second question was the UK.
Yeah.
So you've asked it for US and UK markets. We don't forecast trends overseas. This would be a considerable exercise to study markets we don't operate in and for technologies beyond those we've been asked to execute upon. But I can tell you that a recent research study by Diffraction Analysis, this was done just very recently, May 2012, which utilised primary interviews with a range of international operators, including, amongst others, KPN, Verizon, Orange, HK Broadband Network and Turkcell, found that when comparing fibre to the home or basement ARPU with DSL ARPU for the same players, they found that, in fact, you get an average, when they looked at the market of fibre to the home versus DSL, they found that because of the rising growth in triple play bundles, the same service purchased on a fibre to the premise, when bundled, was 30% on average below that of separate products over DSL. The discounts, in fact, range in the 10 to 50%, but we're on average 50%. We, as I said, we don't do sophisticated analysis in detail of those overseas markets, as it would be a great deal of work and not something that we have been asked or tasked to do by the government. So that's the conclusion.
Well,
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Quigley.
Thanks for that.
Chair, would you like me to come back to that question?
Yes, if you want to.
He's got an update.
No. Whilst Mr. Quigley was talking, I read through the question again, and I do think that as written, it does make sense, but I understand equally that Mr. Quigley has gone through a lot of work to come up with the answers that he's given to some of the questions here, and obviously that was done in a short period of time. But to look at this last question on page 1, what proportion of each of these categories of Australian premises? That is clearly a reference to the 6 categories dot pointed above of Australian premises. Now, I note in your answer, Mr. Quigley, you gave the answer by different categories from those specified there, with reference to the 2010 ABS data. So, obviously, if you, as I expect you will, take this on notice, unless you have the information readily at your hand, I'm happy for you to do it by the categories that you've chosen of the 2010 ABS data instead of the 6 categories here. So what proportion of each of these categories of Australian premises does NBN Co estimate its network rollout, broken down by satellite, fixed wireless and fibre, will have covered or passed at each of the above dates? The above dates, as you correctly pointed out when I didn't notice it, being those at the top of the page, the end of each of the financial years, 2011-12, financial year 2012-13, financial year 2013-14 and calendar year 2013. So what are we looking for there? I'd have thought it was relatively straightforward. At the end of each of those years in question, broken down by each of those segments of Australian premises according to their current internet capacity, what proportion of those premises in those segments will have received satellite access, fixed wireless access or fibre access that has covered or passed them?
Okay. I understand the question, Senator. I'm afraid we won't be able to answer it. And the reason we won't be able to answer it is we don't know which premises are in each of those categories from the ABS data.
So is 2010 ABS data the best you've got to go on, Mr. Quigley? Is this part of course, what you were highlighting in your opening statement?
I think it's good to quote the Australian Bureau of Statistics data. I mean, that's not NBN Co data, that's the Australian Bureau of Statistics. By the way, we don't have access necessarily to retail service providers' information about speeds. The Australian Bureau of Statistics very well may have. The problem I see, just to make sure you understand why it would be impossible for us to answer the question as you posed it now, what it's saying is you take Australia, you carve it up into these categories, but these categories are premises that are scattered all over the place. They're individual premises or scattered all over the place in each of these characters. So how do we know which premises they are and therefore which technology is serving them and at what speeds?
So is that because the ABS data doesn't drill down to individual premises, it just has numbers?
Yes, exactly right.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Quigley. In that sense, you have answered the question. I might think about whether there's a different way to approach it. Come in. Whether there's a different way to approach it.
Steve, you can come in now.
That's right, yeah. Who's there? Whether there's a different way to approach it, perhaps dealing with the FSLAMs as the regions that you work with or some other means. But we can think about that. Mr. Quigley, just while we're going through those questions as well, in a number of instances you answered questions with reference to the information provided to the Joint Committee on the NBN. Now, I do note that in a number of those cases, the information provided to that Joint Committee is simply for the period up until the 31st of December, whereas in a number of cases we've asked either for the period of time over a number of years, those years that I read out before, or indeed for the 12 months up till now. So if it's possible, in the convenient time of looking over questions on notice to see whether any of that extra information could be provided, that would be appreciated as well.
Minister, can I just seek some clarification here? The Joint Committee on the NBN has got quite a wide remit. The work of estimates is narrower than that Joint Committee on NBN. I'm just wondering, given now that we're being asked questions, that NBN's been asked questions at estimates that go even further than the Joint NBN Committee is seeking or receiving answers on, how do you read the relationship between the Estimates Committee and the Joint NBN?
I'm the only unlucky person
sounds like
in the
a
room
question for
who's
the
not
clerk
a
of the
member
Senate.
of the or attends the Joint Parliamentary Committee. So I haven't had the pleasure of participating in your discussions. So, oh, my apologies. I thought you were. Yeah.
Senator Bushby as well.
Oh, sorry. Senator Bushby is a recent joining us in the room. My apologies. But the usual suspects are all here.
It's just an opinion. It can't,
Well,
that committee can't
Fisher,
take away from the
order.
work of
I'm
estimates.
asking Senator Conroy for a point of view.
There is actually a very defined set of rules about the questions to be asked here. We generally give a fair bit of latitude, but when it comes to dealing with the issues around the corporate plan, I mean, we have a process we've agreed under the Joint Parliamentary Committee to release information every 6 months. Everyone was happy with that. We'll be updating the corporate plan shortly, and then there'll be more information supplied on a 6-monthly basis to the committee. So, within reason, we're happy to take the questions. We are, can I say, very pleased to finally see some questions and estimates about the financial performance, because I did want to take up a point which I did find a little gratuitous in the letter from Senators Birmingham and Fisher in reference to Mr Quigley and the number of questions that he answered or didn't answer, because I've actually done some research as well. And at the additional estimates 13 to 16 of February 2012, the coalition senators asked at the Senate estimates hearings 140 questions. It is. The number of questions that, out of those 140, the number of questions asked directly on the financial performance of NBN Co was 22. In the supplementary estimates hearing of 17th to 20th of October 2011, the number of questions asked by coalition senators was 120. The number of questions asked directly related to financial performance of NBN Co was 24. Then there was the infamous Alcatel questionings. There was 276 questions in the budget estimates of 23rd of May, 16th of in 2011, of which only 29 of 276 questions were on the financial performance of NBN Co.
I think you've got
On the
too many staff,
21st to the
Senator Conroy.
24th of February
The type of
2011
analysis that
estimates,
suggests they've got a little too much
171
spare time on
questions
their hands.
asked of NBN Co. 32 were on the financial performance. And supplementary estimates in October 2010, 252 questions, of which only 30 were on the financial performance. So I welcome the coalition deciding to finally start asking questions about the financial performance, but it's just a bit rich to accuse Mr Quigley of not providing a range of information when they've been too lazy to ask them at Senate estimates.
Thanks, Senator Ludlam.
All right, so there was some
How long, Dave?
information
How long?
in there that was new to us, but I want to come back to this issue that was handballed to Mr Harris at the time, which is around change of government risks. Because as you could tell from the tones of the questions opposite, and indeed the whole premise of the letter that was put to you, Mr Quigley, is that you are facing a change of government risk as far as the coalition are concerned. And this is an attempt to get a reliable data set so that when they, roll into government, on the red carpet, as though it's been preordained, they'll be able to presumably break your network up and do it in an entirely different way. Do you have, I don't know if forgive me if this is easily reportable or
I could find this out somewhere. The whole point of having a uniform wholesale price is that some of the premises you're connecting will be paying much less than what it costs to provide the service.
That's correct.
And some of the vast majority will be paying much more than it costs to put them onto the network, and thereby we smooth the price out for the whole country. Is that a fair way to put that?
If I can perhaps answer in a slightly more complex way, remembering that we are a wholesale provider. So our customers who we're selling to are retail customers who add a margin, do what they need to do to end users. So if I look at it from our customers' point of view, the retail service provider, it is certainly the case that if they were going to provide their own facilities to deliver a service that they can deliver on the NBN network, it would cost them considerably more than the price that they're paying us. Now, the differential of that, in some areas, it would be a huge amount more to try and have their own service. The example of that is clearly satellite.
Yeah.
In some cases, it would be not so much more if you're in fibre in places that are easy to get to. So if you had your druthers and you could build in only new developments, only those you wanted to build in, you could ignore most of them and pick the most lucrative ones, you could probably run a reasonable business in providing fibre.
Yeah.
But this type of nationwide network in a country such as Australia, it would be virtually impossible to get uniform wholesale pricing unless the government was doing it.
No, it's the whole premise of the network, and it's why we've supported it, because it's the only way to provide utility scale services, whether it be electricity, water and so. So the premise is fairly well understood. What I'm trying to get a sense of is, do you know what it costs to provide a single user in Jigalong remote Aboriginal community with satellite service, and how does that compare with plugging someone in Vic Park in central Perth?
On the fibre?
Yeah, just for you. Don't worry about your retailer, but for your company.
Yes, we would know what that cost would be. I mean, we'd have to do some allocation of overhead costs, obviously, across the company, but
5 times, 10 times,
we could do that,
20
yes.
times, 30 times.
It would be a multiple.
Yeah, and for the purposes of tonight, I'm trying to create homework for you or different categories of reporting or whatnot, but I'm trying to work out where the break-even point is. The vast majority of your customers are going to be paying you slightly more than it costs you to hook them up, which is how you're going to be able to provide very expensive satellite services at a very cheap wholesale price. What I'm interested to know is whether we have a sense of the ratio or the number of people who we're subsidising relative to those who are doing the subsidising.
Yes, I understand the question. I think we'd have to go away and do a bit of work on that. It would certainly be, if you think about the endpoints of that, clearly in the last 10%, it's unprofitable. It'd be somewhere further down that curve.
Yeah, it approaches infinity, and that's why we're not cabling up the whole country.
Absolutely right, yes. It goes up very rapidly, beyond 90% or so. It's where the knee starts to take place. So, if you like, that break-even point was clearly going to be below the 90%. Exactly where it sits, we would have to do some modelling.
I know you're a busy guy, so I'm not asking for something that's down to too many decimal places. I'm looking for an order of magnitude estimate. So the reason I'm asking this is that you've been required, partly by the Minister and partly by the Parliament, to go out and do the hard stuff first. So by the end of 2013, say there's an election in September, October of next year, you're a lot further down the track of providing a very expensive wireless and satellite service, and you will have nowhere near the customer base in the big cities to support that subsidy. Is that more or less true?
Correct, yes. And we'll have built a transit network as well, a large part of the transit network.
I want to get to that in a tick. So what I'm trying to work out, and I know it's not your job to do the change of government risks, but I guess it is our role as a parliament to understand what the change of government risks are, is by September or October next year, what's the ratio going to be of, if everything is suddenly brought to a screaming halt, of how are you going to be able to pay for the expensive services if you don't have the revenue base in the big cities? What kind of business are you going to look like?
You couldn't, you're in a complete subsidy basis. You couldn't run a business that. If you halt the network, if you halt the rollout at that point, you just can't run a business. You don't have a business to run.
So what would happen if you tried to sell it, for example?
You wouldn't find a buyer.
No, you could give it away for $1, but it was still probably...
It's going to be a colossal liability.
Yeah. No, but essentially it would transfer back onto the budget because by definition it is no longer an investment. So the entire cost would transfer back onto the budget.
Mr Quigley, if you'd be able to provide us, on the basis of what you know, and I respect that things have been delayed by the issues that you outlined in your opening statement, where we will be by the third quarter of next year, with your customers who are above your break-even point as opposed to the customers who are below it. Is that a relatively easy figure to estimate this far out?
Well, the difficulty you have, there would be no customers who are above a break-even point, because you've got to look at the company as a whole, and the company's invested in building a transit network and launching 2 satellites. You just simply, there are no customers. This project only makes sense on a nationwide basis.
Right. So what
You just can't slice it up in pieces and run a business and get a return that's above the government bond rate unless you do it all.
I guess that's the point that I'm trying to make. You're quoted in a piece in the AFR today, which goes to where I think you were taking us before, around the transit network, that you're building that, and that is going to be useful infrastructure whether somebody comes along and bowls this all over or not. You'll have fibre out to Newman, for example, that doesn't exist at the moment. Can you give us an idea of how much of your current expenditure is based on doing that backbone work in the transit network, and how much of it is the kind of street-to-street work in metropolitan areas? I think when we spoke in February, you still had your hands tied behind your back on the street-to-street work because we didn't have a deal with Telstra.
So I'd have that, once again, that would be something I have to go back and work on, Senator, because as you would understand, the work is just starting on, has been starting now for some time. We're building up the investment in the access part, and the transit network has been underway. And as I said, we turned on the first ring in Berkeley Vale. We've got quite a number now coming on stream relatively shortly. So that obviously that ratio changes on a week by week, month by month basis. So I have to go back and look at that.
Maybe I should have submitted my own log of claims before we came into the session. You mentioned at the outset that some of the address data you'd been given was wrong as high as 30% of the time. Did I mishear that?
In MDUs, and it's not so much that people are supplying us with data they know to be wrong. It's just that this data is very difficult to gather, because PSMA does the very best possible job they can of collating and what they call washing data sources from lots of places. But until you really get out on the street and walk it and check, is this database correct?
30%?
In MDUs, yes, it's possible. Now, it's lower. In fact, it's more up in terms of 95% accuracy in SDUs, but in MDUs, it's quite a difficulty for us.
What were your projections in your original business plan? Did you have a guess as to how accurate that data would be?
We had assumed that the address database we could get would be considerably more accurate.
Would be cleaner than that?
Yeah.
Okay. Just before I send you off on a wild goose chase, my question before, when I went to you about the cost of providing a service as opposed to the revenue that you were getting per customer, and you put to me that you've got cost allocation issues and overheads right across the whole company, what I'm asking for is an estimate of what proportion of customers will cover their marginal cost by third quarter of next year. Does that help or hinder?
Not much, I don't think. But let us take it on board and see what we can do. It could be quite a difficult question to answer.
I'm only looking for an order of magnitude estimate as well. So anything with decimal places need not apply. The other thing that I think was very, very interesting in your opening statement was the rather surprising uptake on the fastest speed tier.
Yes.
Now, your revenue projections and your average revenue per user, which underpins the entire model of your company, is highly sensitive to that ratio of the people sitting on the 12.1 package as opposed to those who've shot for the moon. So this is a sample of what, 11,000 people or so?
This is, well, if you look at the fibre, it's probably closer to 3,500, 4,000. So
okay.
We're here talking about those ratios on speeds, because on the satellite, obviously the interim satellites, it's 6 meg down, 1 meg up. So those speed tiers we're seeing on the fibre.
Yeah, let's just stick to that for the moment. So a 38 to 50% uptake on the fastest tier.
Yes.
That is completely at odds with what you were estimating in the business plan for memory.
we didn't have it at such a high ratio, but
No.
you also need to take account, Senator, that we got early adopters
Yes.
on this, and perhaps Mr Hassel would like to add something to this. It's his area, and he's done a looked at this in some detail.
Yes, thanks very much. Yes, I mean, it is...
Mr. Haslett, if you just indicate for the Hansard your name and position.
Oh, sorry, yes, my name is Jim Hassel. I'm the head of product management and sales at NBN Co.
Thank you.
So yes, to respond to your question, we've been very greatly encouraged by the take-up at the high end of the speeds.
So, yeah.
And also very greatly encouraged that that's continued as well. So it was the case very early on, and we thought that that would be very much around early adopters, but it's continued over the months, as I think Mr Quigley went through in his explanation.
How far at odds are those early numbers off a very small sample with the projections that you put in your business plan for once the network's fully built out?
Well, our in the corporate plan, the 2010 corporate plan, our assumptions were that the 12.1 service would be something like, I think it was about 54%.
What end up being 18?
Yes. And our assumption was that the 140, the top one, would be about 8%.
And that ended up being what, 34, 35? 38.
It's about 38, yeah.
So it's upside down.
Yes.
What do you think is going to happen to those numbers over time? Because as I say, the whole premise of the business is based on the fact that nothing like those numbers of people will end up taking up your fastest package. Because if they do, you're running a much, much more lucrative business than the Minister was hoping you would.
Then, because we have a fixed return, we lower prices faster.
You lower prices,
Yes.
or you hand money back to the government, or that just pushes your wholesale price down?
We I think it's a subject of an ACCC discussion.
This is the SAU.
This is the SAU. We can only earn, if the SAU is accepted, 350 basis points above the long-term running average government bond rate. Once we get above that, we will just decrease prices. But I also should say, Senator, just to put a word of caution in here, when we get into the main migration of the copper onto the fibre network, we expect that ratio to start shifting around a bit. What I think it's fair to say is that we are very comfortable with the assumptions we made in our corporate plan. In other words, we've de-risked. This data is de-risking the corporate plan.
It's de-risking it in that you pitched a worst-case scenario that people would mostly use the slower service.
We, as in all corporate plans of this sort, I've never done one quite this big, but I try to make sure that the company is conservative.
All right. Well,
But time will tell. We simply don't know yet.
well, I hope you're given the opportunity to find out.
Yes.
I really do. Thanks very much, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Birmingham.
Thanks very much, Chair. Mr Quigley, has the board met to sign off on the corporate plan?
Not yet. That takes place next Monday.
Next Monday?
Correct.
How convenient.
Well, that's the scheduled meeting. It's not just the meetings are
that's-
scheduled a year ahead.
this is our scheduled
You're
meeting
right.
too,
Yeah,
Mr
exactly. No,
Quigley.
they sit there and they plot their meetings around your meetings, Senator Birmingham.
Well, it's
keep on living in hope.
well, it is amazing how
You
many.
keep on living in hope.
It is amazing how many of the answers to questions on notice we've received refer to the fact that such information will be contained in the updated corporate plan, which was due in
GBA
May.
guidelines set out the end of May.
It's May 31st is when it's due.
It's the GBA guidelines, probably put in place by your government previously.
Well, I'd hate for anybody to be more helpful than the absolute letter of the guidelines in that regard. Nonetheless,
Just to be clear on that, your board meetings, they are consistent with the guidelines for GBEs?
Yes, that's exactly right. The board made sure it met before the corporate plan is due, so that it could sign off on the corporate plan. Now, of course, the board is not going to be seeing the plan for the first time afresh. We have been working with the board for quite some time as we develop the plan.
The sort of implication that's been put that your board meetings have been scheduled to frustrate the operation of this committee. What's your comment on that?
No,
I don't know what to say
I
to
wasn't
this.
saying to frustrate
Company
necessarily, but it
Well,
certainly
well,
isn't scheduled to
What were you
assist.
saying?
It certainly
What-
isn't scheduled to
What
assist.
were you saying?
It certainly is not scheduled to assist.
Okay, let's go into some
Just get
serious
over
stuff.
yourself, Senator Birmingham. The board's actually, I
So-
don't think the Secretary of the Board even knows the date of estimates.
So I'm pretty sure Mr Quigley does, because he's always very diligent at attending, which we appreciate. Minister, how quickly will you release the corporate plan once it is provided to you?
Within a reasonable time frame. I'm not suggesting the next day, but within a reasonable time frame. I'm not talking about 6 months, but we need to look at it and consider all of the issues raised in it.
Okay. Thank you, Minister. Mr Quigley, there's some reports in the financial review today, and Senator Ludlam has already referred to that article, which suggest certain changes to the business plan. Are there inaccuracies in this article?
Not sure I recall it. Could you, what does it say, Senator, if I can ask you?
Okay. Will the business plan submit to government a new timetable for connections?
As I said, it will be consistent with the 12-month and 3-year plan that we announced in February and March.
It will be consistent with those 12-month and 3-year plans, but obviously will change the timetable for connections in the longer term. Is that the case? The business plan will presumably cover more than just those 12-month, 3-year...
Change starting date.
Yes.
It'll reflect the change starting date.
It will reflect the change starting date in terms
as in
of...
the Telstra deal taking
Yep.
8 to 9 months longer than we anticipated at the time. But
Right. Starting date is in that sense. So that will see delays in terms of what was suggested in the original corporate plan.
well, if the starting
this
date's
corporate
changed,
plan.
it's not a delay.
Well,
The corporate plan was a
the
prediction.
dates of delivery will be later than they were in the first corporate plan, if we want to play nuanced
that is
language.
no, that's a more accurate way to describe it. But the corporate plan reflected a view that the Telstra deal would be signed by X date. It was signed by Y date. So all of the assumptions that flowed from the signing of X date moved back to beginning from Y date. So the way you described it the second time round was a more accurate description.
Right.
Not spending so much time.
Thank you, and I'm sure Mr Quigley will correct us as we go if the descriptions are incorrect, if you don't, Minister. So the dates will be later than the original plan. In terms of the number of premises covered by particular dates, allowing for that slippage in the Telstra agreement, allowing for that slippage, are they all expected to still be met?
What all expected to matter?
Well, there's assumptions that were in there which are, I think, probably not you to be fair, but other members of the coalition have tried to play games with. Like, for instance, the assumption that's in the plan at the moment that NBN will be doing all of the fibre to the greenfields,
yes.
Whereas a whole range, 35,000, I think has now been discussed widely, was handed back to Telstra. So there'll be a reflection in the number of connections based on the fact that NBN Co no longer has responsibility following the agreement for a range of connections. So there won't be apples and apples in the way you're suggesting. I'm hoping that actually makes sense.
Indeed. So there'll be some changes to the timelines associated with the delayed completion of the Telstra deal. There will be some reductions in the connections of premises connected with the slower start to greenfields connections by NBN, or the handing back,
transfer of responsibility.
Transfer of responsibility. Beyond those two factors and the impacts of those two factors, will there be any other delays compared with the earlier corporate plan in terms of the number of premises delivered by within a certain time?
I think probably most best way to look at it, Senator, is if you look at the 12-month and 3-year plan that we announced publicly in February and March, they, as I said, the last, I think, JCBN meeting, that is the best source of data, not going back to a plan, as I said, it was created barely a year after the company was in existence and now some 18 months ago. So if you look at that 12-month and 3-year plan, that's the best source of data.
So 758,000 homes will be started or completed by
The end of this calendar year.
this calendar year, and 3.5 million will have been completed or started
By June 2015. And then you would assume, and which is contained in the corporate plan, that the company will be doing its best to try and recover some of the shift in the start date and the end date, as you would in such a project.
So, Mr Quigley, if you want us to compare with those 12-month and 3-year plans instead of with the original corporate plan,
Yes?
enlighten me, because right now I can't memorise what was in one versus what is in the other. Aside from the factors of Greenfield's change and the Telstra change, was there any slippage from the original corporate plan, or change from the original corporate plan to those 12-month and 3-year plans?
Yes, of course, there was a change, yes. The Telstra, in the original corporate plan, we had assumed that...
Yeah, I'm saying
Yes.
aside from
Yes.
the Telstra...
They are fairly dramatic changes.
Well,
Yes.
They are actually dramatic changes.
which
The
is why I'm sure it's
assumptions
going
that
to be far
underpinned
easier.
it was competition with Telstra, building our own network. The assumption after the Telstra deal, so not just the ramp-up phase, but the actual assumption changed
Okay,
that we were...
Then let me go back. Is there any other factor that is slowing down the delivery of the NBN service past premises, aside from the handback of Greenfield sites and the delay
Yes,
to
from-
Telstra?
It's not just
that
the
will-
handback of Greenfield sites. The government changed the policy
Okay.
on Greenfield.
Whichever... No,
That's what
please,
was
no, please
negotiated
don't.
with Telstra.
I'm sure we can come to Greenfield sites during the night. Is there anything else that will cause or has caused a reduction in the speed of delivery?
Yes, at the time we submitted the December 2010 corporate plan, I think Mr McLaren can probably help me out on this one. How long, Gary, was it that we had been advised of the shift from 14 points of interconnect to 121?
Yes, I can answer that.
You probably should
just
do
for
the
the
same thing.
record.
Have you ever-
Yep, my name's Gary McLaren.
Gets paid.
Yep, Chief Technology Officer at NBN Co.
Jim, just
So, from my recollection, we had knowledge of the shift approximately about 4 or 5 weeks.
So that meant that
a few weeks.
we had to make our very best estimate at that time of submitting the plan of what the implication of that would be. Frankly, we underestimated the magnitude of the work that we had to do to re-architect the network. It turned out to be quite an undertaking.
Okay.
But the targets have been set out there now for a number of months.
Yep.
Senator Birmingham.
All right, we'll come to another matter in the AFR story. So I'm just trying to look at the time there. Will there be any increase in the capital requirements of NBN Co from government?
Our projections for the CapEx requirements for the plan will be contained in our corporate plan. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to signal those ahead of submitting them first putting them to the board and then submitting them to the government.
The Optus deal, if approved, brings a pull forward of activity. More connections get made quicker. And so there is a logical situation where the Optus deal has an impact, again, which was prior to, at the time there was no Optus deal. So if the Optus deal is approved, and that's still in the balance with the ACCC, there is a potential impact there.
That would just be a timing impact.
Yeah, no, it's a pull through. So, but inside the first 7 or 8 years, there, by definition, because you're pulling stuff in, it goes up in that 7 or 8 years. So the total doesn't change. Potentially, sorry, let me just check on something. So, yeah, in terms of... So the connection's done faster. There's a range of things that happen faster that are pulled through, which means in the early years, before the company was raising its own capital, which is after, I think it was 8 years, happy to be corrected. So there's some pull forward because of the Optus deal, which is a revenue positive deal for the company because they get more connections faster, but it also means they need to spend a bit more, a bit faster. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, that makes sense.
So the Optus
Minister.
deal has an impact, but it hasn't been approved.
Okay, but aside from that timing impact, for the capital injections to the company, the figure that you widely state, Minister, I think is $36 billion. Is that your figure?
I'm talking about something slightly different to what you're talking about, so my apologies. I'm talking about peak equity from the government's contribution inside the envelope.
Right.
I'm saying there's a shift inside the envelope.
Yes, sure.
Which make, okay. Look, I wouldn't want to predict yet. There's a number of assumptions that the board still haven't finalised yet that will have an impact. So I'm just not in a position to second guess where the corporate plan is going to be. There's a range of different factors.
And I certainly understand on this point potentially Mr Quigley's reticence, but Minister, your reticence is noteworthy, shall we say, that if you're not committing that $36 billion is definitely still the figure.
The Optus deal brings forward or increases the capex as well, potentially.
Right.
So again, the Optus deal has 3 or 4 different effects: peak equity effect, internal rate of return effect, as in it's positive, the operating X, and the capex. So the Optus deal has an impact on 3 or 4 different variables if it's approved or not.
Right. Why does the Optus deal raise